edition of the Gaming Careers Podcast, the resource for people looking to find their fit in the gaming industry. I'm Steve Rudusky, your host, and thanks again for joining me. Today we have a really amazing show lined up for you, and I'm very excited to jump into the subject. Today we're going to talk about the differences in risk and reward versus making video games versus tabletop games. My guest today has experience making both types of games and even houses both activities under the same studio. He offers some amazing insights into how to actually reduce your risk if you can produce both tabletop and video games at the same studio. It's pretty exciting stuff, and I know that you're going to want to take lots of notes. Before jumping right into the show, I do want to make two very quick announcements. The first is really a thank you to all of my listeners that have gone over to the Company Bard and given me your feedback on the Gaming Careers Podcast survey. It's been really exciting to read your feedback and get a better idea of the direction that you'd like to see the show take. The second announcement I have is a little bit of a secret, so don't tell anybody, okay? It's just between you and me. But I've just released the very first version, I'm calling it the beta version, of my What Character Class Are You at Work? It's a quick 10-question test that you can take that hopefully is a lot of fun and may even help you work better with that really annoying person at your job that you just normally can't stand. Now, I don't want to talk too much about it, so if you're interested, jump over onto the website and give it a look, and please let me know what you think. Because it's the beta version, it's still pretty rough around the edges, so I think you can think of it as an early game testing opportunity or play testing opportunity for a project that I'm working on. All right, without any further ado, let's jump into the interview.
Today we have an awesome guest with us on the show. His name is David Sanhueza. David is the founder and creative director of Gameogami, a game development studio that focuses on creating games for both mobile and tabletop markets. David, thanks so much for being with us on the show today.
Thank you, Stephen. Happy to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. So before we jump in, can you tell our listening audience who you are in the game space and how you got involved in Gameogami?
Okay, so in the game space, I'm someone who's filled a lot of different roles throughout my career. I've been in the video game industry for about 15 years now, and I've worked as a quality assurance tester on Asheron's Call, which is one of the first big 3D MMO games. I've worked as a 3D artist and animator on a variety of MMO and RTS titles like Empires, Rise and Fall, Mythian, and End of Nations, most recently, two games that I worked on at Petroglyph Games here in Las Vegas.
Okay.
And most recently, I started my own game development studio called Gameogami, like you said, which is developing both board games and video games. And I was the designer and art director for Goblins Duel Fairies Rule, which is the first game that I released, and my upcoming game called Immortal, which will be on Kickstarter soon. And again, I've been the game designer and art director on that game.
That's awesome. So what I find so interesting about Gameogami is the focus on both the mobile and tabletop market. So how did that occur to you, and how do you plan on making that happen?
So Gameogami is, I think, fills a pretty unique niche in the game development sphere because I am making both types of games at once. The reason I got into it is because I love both types of games. I play a lot of video games. I play a lot of board and card games, and I always have since I was young. Since I was about 5 or 6 years old, I knew I wanted to make games ever since I played my first Atari and Commodore 64 games. Later, when I was a teenager, I really got into like role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. There was a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles role-playing game.
Yes.
There was an Amber Diceless role-playing game. So there was a lot of like different role-playing games I got into, and then Magic the Gathering, which is the big trading card game. So playing both games all my life and enjoying both, I always had ideas for both that I wanted to make into reality. And that's where Gameogami came into, because I think there's a lot of games that I believe I could execute well on and get out there. And I think there's some benefits to the cross-development of doing them, particularly in the fact that if you develop a product for one platform, you could then port it to another. And I'm not talking about developing a game for the PC and then porting to the PlayStation. I'm talking about developing a physical board or card game and then making the digital version of that, which people could play on their PCs or on their iPads.
And that's something that I'm fiercely interested in. So with the developing something that's a board or cards and then making a mobile version of that, is that kind of the primary thrust of Gameogami? Is that like how you're wanting to start off with developing both platforms, or are you working on an app on one side that's kind of independent IP on one side and tabletop doing something completely different?
That's a great question. So I do have a lot of ideas, which could be potentially just focused on one particular platform. Like I have a lot of ideas for action games or MMO games that really wouldn't translate well to a physical game, and vice versa. Some games that I think would make really interesting card games or board games, but that I don't know would really translate well to a digital form. So those are the projects that I'm not touching right now, because I think the real focus for making Gameogami successful is to focus on those products that really do cross over well, so I can reuse a lot of that work. So any money I spend, any time I spend on a game that I'm developing, I know I can save time and money because those will end up being used in another project.
And that's a really interesting point. And I have a little bit of background in software game development working at BioWare, but can you speak to our audience a little bit about how you can repurpose or reuse some of those assets and how the same thing might apply on both platforms?
Right. So the first one, the most obvious one is the game design, right? So if you're going to port a physical game over to a digital version, you're basically just reinterpreting that design so it can work on a mobile or PC platform. So that game design, like all that work you put into designing the systems, the game balance, that stuff is something that you're going to reuse. Now, there's other things that you won't, like, for example, the user interface is going to be different because with physical games, it's a human interface, right? It's physical stuff you're picking up and moving around, and you have physical constraints, which sometimes can be a big advantage, but other times are a little tricky because you're dealing with that human element. Like the rules, for example, like writing a rule book is very important for a physical game, tabletop game, because the humans, your players are the ones who are actually going to be executing that game, right? Based on the rules, based on the components, you have to make your rules really airtight, or in the video game space, what we would call a bug, right? An error that happens where the game breaks.
Right.
Humans can break the game all the time if your rules aren't clear enough for them.
Humans are infinite state machines, huh?
Exactly. They are like it's weird. Like something that I found really interesting about developing both kinds of games is that the technical restraints is one of the biggest problems for video games, right? Like just being able to create a game that doesn't break, right? The technology has to be there. The code has to be solid. Even artwork and even files can create bugs. Sometimes it isn't in the code. Sometimes it's the problem with the file itself, that asset, which is breaking the game. So there's a lot of technical restraints, which is one of the biggest hurdles to creating a game that's solid on the digital space. But with the physical space, there aren't a lot of technical hurdles. You can, which makes them excellent. Like tabletop games are excellent to rapidly design and prototype because you can just do it with pen and paper. You don't have the technical hurdles that video games have with the game engines and the code. But the humans, your players, that human element becomes the technical constraint because it won't work unless the game is designed well enough and communicated well enough for them to go through the engine, the design of the game, to go through all those steps perfectly every time.
Right. And as it relates to the art assets, I mean, I'm not sure if our listening audience is aware. Are there any special considerations that someone would need to be aware of in order to port the art from a board game to a digital mobile space?
Yeah. So art is one of the other big things that can easily be reused from one platform to the next.
Okay.
A lot of the first games that I'm developing are very illustration heavy. One of the main reasons that illustrations can really help sell a board game or a card game, especially if you're putting a game up on Kickstarter, great artwork can really raise the success level for your project. So I develop games that are very illustration heavy, that have great artwork, that, could draw people from other sources. Just browsing artwork on the internet, it's like, oh, I think that picture's really cool. I love that character. What's that from? Oh, it's from this game. And that can be brought over very easily to the digital space, particularly on the PC, because you're dealing with a big screen. For the mobile, tablets and especially phones, like the iPhone and Android phones, that can be a little tricky to translate well because you have a very limited screen space.
Interesting.
Board games and card games have that physical, advantage of, like, you're dealing with real physical pieces, and as long as the table's big enough, you can make the game as big enough and the artwork is as big and beautiful as you want. If you're playing a game on a phone, and board games and card games tend to have a lot of information that the players have to absorb and deal with, at any one time, which was one of the things that makes them very fun. They're basically turn-based strategy games, which were very popular on the PC and have been becoming very popular on mobile games, right? So basically they were turn-based strategy games. Now we kind of blend them over and just call them, board games and strategy games. But the board games benefit from the fact that you can have all that information out at once. You just kind of look it over at your buddy's side of the table and see what's going on there. Trying to cram all that information, both, in terms of numbers, text, and visuals on a little phone screen is very challenging. And that's one of probably the biggest challenges of porting a board or card game to the mobile platform, is just you have very little space, and you got to be very creative in how you communicate all that information without, covering the screen and just stuff.
Interesting. Okay. So since we're talking about kind of how to make a game on, both platforms and considerations between both, can you compare for us a little bit about the development timelines for a board/card game versus a video game? I know you have experience in both.
Yes. So as I mentioned earlier, the time to design and prototype a physical game can be really quick. I mean, you could have a game, even a solid game, potentially designed in a day and then prototyped in the next day. It might not be a particularly very, very good game at the start, but you can have at least your game is ready to play potentially in a day or two, right? And you can play test it with your friends, see if the game is good enough, to even be worth pursuing. And if it is,
no cards and stick figures.
Stick figure, anything, right?
Well, I'm just like, no cards and stick figures, and you're good to go.
Absolutely. A piece of paper becomes your board. You grab some dice from you blow off dust off your old copy of Monopoly, and you take the dice from that, and that's, your dice component, right? So they're very easy to put together and play test in a ridiculously short amount of time. And then it takes the actual design time of then iterating on that idea, making a fun game, could you take weeks, months, or years? Like I think Dan Yarrington on your earlier podcast says, a board game development costs, one die 6 years or something like that, right? Because you'll never know when it's done until it feels done, and you can't predict when that'll be ready.
Right.
Goblin's Jewel Fairy's Rule, because it's such a simple game, came about in a relatively short period of time. I think my design process on that was maybe like 2 months. I had it kind of designed and play tested in a day, and over the course of 2 months refined it until I felt it was good enough to publish because it was so simple. Immortals, on the other hand, I've been working on that for 3 years because it's a much more complex game, and because it's a very competitive game, getting that game balance and that game flow just right took a lot of time and a lot of finessing through just playtest. But I was able to start playtesting it, at least at the beginning, very quickly because there's not a big, time barrier there for boards and card games. Now with the video games, the development time can be much longer because, like I mentioned before, you have that technical constraints of you have to have your game engine built. You have to have the game, logic built. You have to code all that together. Or even if you're making some kind of like, plug and play game making, software, which there are quite a few out there now, and people are using them to make, mobile games. Even then, getting all those systems in place and getting them to actually work together and, not break, not crash your machine or not do what you don't want to do, that can take a lot of time, even with a very talented, programmer on your team.
Sure.
So getting to the point where you can actually reliably play test your game and see if it's fun, depending on the size of your game, that could take a week and it could take 3 years. Like I've unfortunately worked on some projects in the video game industry, the most complex ones, which are, MMOs, right?
Sure.
Massively multiplayer online games have a ton of systems to deal with, and also have the problem of networking, with potentially thousands of players at the same time. There's so many things that can go wrong with that on the technology side, and sometimes that technology really isn't ready until a couple of years in. And it's weird. Often, the game is in a beta stage, the last couple of months of development, and that's where people are finding out whether the game is fun or not. And unfortunately, sometimes it's
right.
not fun, and you've spent millions of dollars and 2.5 years on a game which probably shouldn't have been made in the first place.
Yep, and we ran into that at BioWare a bit, just the discovery process. You have a build that comes out every 2 to 4 weeks, and that's the window from a QA standpoint when you get to look at it. And then, as you said, in the beta state, that's when the game is determined fun or not, and you don't get to find out until the very, very end.
Right, and that's why I would never, at least with Gameogami, because I've worked on so many of those kinds of projects, I would never want to make that kind of project with Gameogami. Like, as a very small studio, and because of my previous experience, I always want to work on small projects, which I feel like I could get done. And when it comes to the actual implementation, not necessarily design, but the actual implementation done within about a year or less.
Okay. Year or less. That's your target for a video game.
Right. Or particularly a board game when it comes to actual development part of it. The design, like I said, the design with any game, can be a little fluid, and especially if you're not working on the design full time, right? And you're not play testing it every day. Yeah, that can stretch out over quite a bit of time.
Excellent. And that brings up a good point. As far as the time invested for video games versus tabletop games, and compared to its return on investment. So, can you talk a little bit about the potential return on a video game versus a tabletop game? Because I know we hear a lot that, printing costs are very expensive. Yes. And how does that compare to the digital production time versus its distribution model?
That's a great question, because that is by far the biggest difference between the two mediums. Is that the question of what are the differences between physical and digital? And when you're dealing with a physical medium, you're dealing with manufacturing, you're dealing with shipping. And like I said, the prototyping and development of that can happen really quickly, but the actual creating it into a physical product that you can buy off the stores is painfully slow.
Right.
While on the other hand, like the digital side, that development, especially if it's a complex game that potentially you run into a lot of bugs, the development of that game can really stretch out. But releasing that game is so quick, especially now with digital distribution. You can finish your game and have it up for sale. If you're doing it from your own website, pretty much immediately. And if you're doing it through Steam or through the App Store, very quickly, especially the App Store, the time for them to review and publish that game is surprisingly quick, right? If your game is ready to be released. So to actually be done with the game and actually have it available for sale and out there for people to play on the digital side is so fast. But for a physical game, it's the not only just developing it, but once you have everything done, everything ready, all those files ready, off to a manufacturer, that could take months and sometimes many months. There's delays that could happen if the manufacturer makes mistakes. Maybe you made mistakes on the file size; they weren't quite right, for what you wanted the end product to look like. So they'll send you proofs of an original print of your game, so you can go over it, see what's wrong, see what's ready to go. That is a process that can take many months.
Right.
And so any delay in that, a small miscommunication or one bad file could delay the production of your game, weeks or months. And then once it is ready to produce, the printing takes a long time, and then the shipping. Most people are getting their games manufactured in China, it's going to take a long time for that literally slow boat from China. It's going to take a long time to get your game into a warehouse, and then you got to ship it to people. So to get a game from what you feel is done to actually in the hands of people could easily take 6 months to a year.
So if we're to kind of crystallize this, I guess the tabletop market is easy to develop, hard to realize, I guess, or get shipped into your customers' hands.
Hard to distribute, I would say, I guess.
Hard to distribute, okay. And then the opposite is almost true for video games.
Yes.
So it's a much longer development process, but easy to distribute.
Yes.
Okay, so listeners out there thinking about both options out there, I mean, you're going to have to put it into your spreadsheets and figure out what your risk versus reward is, and basically how much time do you have and how much money do you have to work these development process up before seeing any sort of turnaround on that.
Right, and that gets into the risk versus reward, which is also very different for both platforms. With video games, the risk is very high, I feel, and the reward is very high.
Okay.
A lot of time and money can be spent on video games, which never make back that money because our industry is so saturated. There's just so many games out there. A lot of them junk, but also a lot of them good games. There are thousands of great games out there, amidst the tens of thousands of terrible games. And so there's a lot of competition out there for recognition and for players' dollars. So our industry is so hit-based where some games are just making tons and tons of money. They become the popular games, and then there's other games which may even be great games, but just fall flat. They're commercial failures, even if they're a critical success. So the chance that you're actually going to make back your investment, let alone make a massive profit off a video game, can be very, very small, right?
Interesting.
But,
okay.
Because they're especially on the App Store, for example, a lot of games will go out, be published on there, and sink right to the bottom. People never find out about them. You might only get a couple hundred downloads on your game that you've been working on for a while, and that can be heartbreaking to people.
Right.
And then some game like Flappy Bird, some silly, simple game comes out and it's making $50,000 a day because it won the lottery, right? It's just it's such a hit-based industry, so the risk is high, but the reward is so high. You can make millions of dollars off of video games. Nobody's making millions of dollars off of board games, or at least not one particular board game, right? Like Wizards of the Coast is, right? Because they got Magic the Gathering and Dungeons and Dragons, right? But so with board games, I think the risk is a lot lower because yes, they're expensive to manufacture, less expensive to develop, but with artwork costs and time costs, that can still add up. So there can still be quite a bit of an investment needed. Thankfully, we have Kickstarter now, which really helps. Yay! Yeah, seriously.
Right.
But compared to video games, I think the risk is a lot lower because even with a mediocre game can sell a couple hundred to maybe 1,000 copies. I think, and most games only print somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 copies. A game that sells through all 2,000 printed copies is considered a success. A video game that gets, into 2,000 users' hands is considered an absolute failure. Right?
Okay.
And so like Goblin's Rule, Fairy's Rule, we successfully raised the money to do that on Kickstarter. And Kickstarter has been the really big mitigator of risk now. The thing that's really caused the independent board game scene to explode over the past 3 years is really all due to Kickstarter. And so with Kickstarter, we raised the money to manufacture 5,000 copies of Goblin's Rule, Fairy's Rule. So 5,000 sounds like a lot, but in the board game industry, that's a big print run. That's considered pretty big. And we recently just sold out, just about a little over a year after the game was finally released to stores, we were actually out of those 5,000 copies. Now we're talking about.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And to our listening audience out there, that's a big deal, by the way. When you sell out from such a large print run, that's awesome.
Right. In the board game space, which sounds,
right.
That sounds almost silly to be so proud of such a small number, but in the board games case, that's because most games, like I said, don't even get printed more than 2,000 copies and sometimes never get reprinted, right? So there might only be 2,000 copies of that game ever. I mean, you've had people like Jerry Hawthorne from Plaid Hat Games on your podcast. You had Jamie Stegmaier. Both those guys have released games that have sold way more than my game. Like Mice and Mystics, I think is probably in like the tens of thousands print run right now. They have another game that not The Walking Dead, Dead of Winter. Just came out, I think, where they're printing many, many copies. Jamie Stegmaier has had some really big successes. Yellow Games that does like King of Tokyo and those games. There are some games that print way more than I had, and those are the big successes. But even then, They're not, getting into millions of users' hands, which is what a successful video game can do.
Right. But I would still put out there for our listeners that I think they would be very happy if they had 5,000 of their own game that sold out. So, I mean, don't put yourself down as far as that goes.
No, I'm not. Awesome. Maybe I was coming off that way. I'm just trying to compare, like, the difference between the two industries and what's considered a success.
Sure.
Because the revenue you get from these games is also very different in terms of the margins. Like in a board game, in the board game space, you're probably going to make 20% of your MSRP back, from the game, because there are people cutting into that. Like the retailers are going to take half of the MSRP. So when people buy a game from a hobby store, half of that money the store's getting, and the other half goes to pay for having that game on their shelves to sell. And then your distributor who gets to the stores, they're taking a percentage. A lot of the money is going into your printing costs, your manufacturing costs is probably going to take around maybe 20% of your MSRP per box and stuff like that. So you're only getting a small amount back. And then that's got to pay for all your development costs, like the money you spent on art, the money you spent on, the percentage to paying a designer. Like if you're a pure publisher, and you're paying other people to design the games, they're getting a little bit of the money. So you might only be left with maybe a 10% profit on your game at best. Some people lose money producing physical games. So you might only make a 10% profit, but the games sell for more. So if you're making 10% profit on a $50 game, you're getting $5 for every copy of that $50 board game that gets sold. Right, and
compare that to a 99-cent app download.
Absolutely. So your margin on that is you're getting 70%, right? If you're going through Apple. So for every game you sell, if you're selling a typical $1 game on the App Store, you're making 70 cents for every game. That $5 is way more than that 70 cents. But if you're selling 1 million copies, that's $700,000. If you have this quote unquote mega success of 5,000 copies of a board game times 5, that's $25,000. So a successful board game is probably going to make tens of thousands of dollars in profit, as opposed to hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in profit of a mega success video game.
That's really interesting, and I appreciate you walking through some of those numbers, because I would have suspected that there would have been a clear winner. My gut tells me that video games, because the market is so large and it's a digital distribution, your costs are so much lower to distribute, would be a clear winner if you could stay in long enough to develop the game and get it launched. But you're saying that that's not really a clear hands-out winner.
In terms of reward, it's a clear hands-out winner. In terms of the risk, you're never guaranteed to get that money.
I see what you're saying. I got it.
Right. In terms of the risk, board games, especially again with Kickstarter, because you have ability to pre-sell and get the funds needed to print before you actually spend the money on printing, the risk can be a lot lower. And because it's easier to sell, because you're selling less copies, it's easier just to sell through them, to get all those copies sold. Getting the recognition for those games, because the competition isn't as fierce as it is, for video games. They're just easier to sell. It's easier to get your money back. You're charging way more for them. So there's a lot of things that go into the fact that the risk is a lot lower for board games, but the reward is almost ridiculously low. Like this is really an industry to get in for the love of it, not because you want to make money.
Excellent. And that's great advice. And that's something that many of our guests have said. If this is something that makes your heart happy, it's something that you should absolutely pursue. Don't look for the big bang or the big cha-ching off of that necessarily.
Right. I should say something, though, about Gameogami and my motivation for doing this, like board games and video games at the same time.
Absolutely.
I'm not doing it just because I really like board games.
Okay.
My first successful game to get out there, for the board game space is a big hit. It didn't make me that much money personally, but it's a step in what I consider to be a larger picture. The idea of doing the crossover of video games and card games, because the potential reward for video games is a lot higher. I'm using my board game designs to mitigate some of that risk in that big scope of risk and reward for video games. I'm using the physical games as a way to prove out the ideas for games that could be fun on video game space before I spend, the time and money developing them. It can also be used to build an audience. There's a lot of advantages, I think, to sort of using using board games and card games to essentially prototype and be the proof of concept for video games.
Sure, and we talked a little bit about this before, so maybe you can expound on it, about kind of Goblin's Drool, Fairies Rule, kind of being one of the baby steps as part of your master plan. Can you flesh that out a little bit for us?
Sure. So basically the master plan is that I have a lot of ideas that I'm working on and that I eventually want to get out there. So I founded Gameogami not to create a game. It's to create, dozens of games, hopefully, over my lifetime.
Sure.
So Goblin's Drool, Fairies Rule is the first step in that, because it was by far the simplest of the different game ideas that I had designed. I've been designing games most of my life. Like even, when I was 6 years old, playing a game like Legend of Zelda, I loved it so much that I would start scribbling notes on pieces of paper, like drawing little pictures and names, like for my own game, which is basically, it was a clone of Legend of Zelda, right? But like,
sure.
But for my 6-year-old mind, like I was like, this is awesome, I'm making a game. Like I always had ideas for games, often inspired by other games. But from that point on, my designs became more advanced, more original. So I spent a lot of time just as a hobby designing my own games, but they never got past the design stage.
Sure.
Even into my professional career, working as a 3D artist and animator at game studios, I always kept designing games, either designing role-playing games, designing video games, card games like Magic the Gathering type games, stuff like that. I was always designing these on the side as a hobby because I really enjoyed it, and I dreamed of one day making these games a reality. But I never actually pulled the trigger. I never actually made them because I realized they were just far too complex and far too expensive for me to pull off on my own. Like, they were just, I could try to find other people who were interested in it, maybe go in it as a project together, but they're always so risky because my ideas were so grandiose. Goblin's Drool, Fairies Rule was a lot different from most of my previous ideas because it was, I felt, to be a fun game, but incredibly simple. It wouldn't be expensive to make. It wouldn't take a lot of time to develop. And I thought, if I'm actually going to take that leap and finally put something out there that was my own and put it out there professionally, Goblin's Drool, Fairies Rule would be that logical first step, because there'd be the lowest amount of hurdles to actually getting it out there, and it could be used as a springboard for my future projects.
That's awesome. And I have not personally played Goblin's Drool, Fairies Rule, but I have watched a lot of gameplay videos about it.
Oh, really?
And it is, oh yeah, absolutely. And it's fascinating. It's a very simple, very charming game where the cards are double-sided and this really kind of cool card flip mechanic. And it looks very, very captivating.
Thank you.
David, I think we're coming to the end of our time here. Do you have some resources that you would suggest our listeners check out with relationship to either starting their own studio or kind of designing board game / video game crossover?
All right. Okay, everybody get your pencils and paper out, because I've got quite a bit of stuff for you to write down right now. So, like I said, if you're looking for artists, I guess this list is going to kind of go a little randomly, but let's just cover art first. So if you're looking for artists, You can look for them on the internet. DeviantArt is a great place to start. There's also some other places where more professional artists tend to hang out, which is conceptart.org if you're looking for 2D artists, and polycount.com if you're looking for 3D artists. They have some really great forums where incredibly talented people post their work. You can also look for games where you like the artwork. If there's a favorite card game that and you really like the illustrations on that, find out. You can look up on Board Game Geek. Is the easiest place to look. Find out who did the artwork for that game and send them an email. See if they're interested in working on your project. Right. So there's a lot of ways to track people down. Board Game Geek is an incredible resource. If you're doing anything board game, card game related, you should definitely be checking out Board Game Geek, because there's a ton of great discussions going on there about the industry, about game design. It's a resource where you can find out about all sorts of games, so you can know if your game has already been done before or if you think it'll be a unique fit. So BoardGameGeek.com is a great place to go. GameDev.net is a good place to go if you are a game developer, if you're want to learn more about game programming or contact people who are. GameDev.net. There's a lot of indie sites that are popping up. Most recently, there's a Indie Team Up is a new website that started for indie developers to find each other. So if you're an artist looking for a programmer, you're a programmer looking for an artist. Your chocolate and your peanut butter can then come together on this. There's another one called Devil Team, Devel Team, is another similar website. So there's a lot of these websites now popping up, which are almost like indie dating sites that are coming together, right? So if you're looking for people, definitely, again, those art websites I mentioned before, Board Game Geek, and some of these, indie team-up sites are a great place. If you want to learn about actually starting your own business, I highly recommend something I did besides just all the internet searching, was look for your local SCORE chapter. So SCORE is the Service Corps of Retired Executives. And they work with the Small Business Association. So they're basically free business advice for people who are looking to start up or who already have their own business but need help on it. So basically, your local SCORE chapter will have people you can go talk to one-on-one, get great feedback on your business ideas, or answer any questions of like, how do I incorporate? What do I got to do for taxes? Et cetera, et cetera. They can answer those questions, and they put together a lot of useful seminars where like you can go to this like 1 hour seminar on a Saturday. It's like, this is how you write a business plan. This is how you find a lawyer. This is how you do marketing and stuff like that. So they're an incredible and most especially free resource for learning how to start your own business.
That's awesome.
And then there's this excellent podcast, the Game Careers podcast, which I highly recommend you listen to and stick with it, because I get a feeling this is going to be a really good, really useful one.
Oh, thanks so much, David. It makes my heart all happy.
You're welcome. Oh, one last thing. So I'm listing out like 100 sites, but a couple more. Since we're on the topic of podcasts, some other podcasts you should be listening to. The Plaid Hat Games podcast, which earlier you had Jerry Hawthorne on from, just because it's fun. It's probably by far the most entertaining podcast I've ever listened to. It's just a couple of geeks.
Great theme music.
Great, awesome ukulele music at the beginning, and it's just a couple of geeks who make board games, who talk about their experience and are just incredibly funny and incredibly charismatic. It's very entertaining listening, and it's great to hear, because they're an indie board game publisher, just to hear their experience with the industry. It's a great way to learn from their successes and mistakes. And then lastly, if you're interested on launching a project on Kickstarter, which many of you probably are, if you plan on doing your own games someday, then you may be interested in using Kickstarter to raise the funds for that. There's the Funding the Dream podcast by Richard Bliss. It also goes by the name The Game Whisperer. But the podcast is called Funding the Dream, and it's this awesome series of podcast episodes that are just full of good advice about running and marketing your own Kickstarters from actual Kickstarter project creators.
Absolutely, and I will double endorse that as well. I listen to it all the time. I just finished the most recent episode that, as of this taping, was 230. I've listened to all 230, and it's really acting as kind of bedrock for the projects that I'm working on with the Gaming Careers podcast. So definitely, I commend that to you for your listening.
Awesome.
Excellent. So, David, let's talk a little bit about what you're working on right now. If you can talk to us about your projects and where people can find you.
All right. So they can find me on my website is gameogami.com. That's GAME hyphen O hyphen GAMI.
Okay.
So kind of like origami, but with game in front of it. But you can just type in, you don't even need to put the dashes. Just look up Gameogami and I'll come up. I'm on Twitter under that name, under Facebook under that name. But my website, gameogami.com, is the number one place to find news about what I'm doing and to see images of the games I'm making. Like we talked earlier about the artwork for Goblins, Jewel, Fairies Rule. You can find, see all of that there. And my new project, Immortal, which I'm working on, there's a lot of information there as well. And then that's what I'm currently working on. This strategy game that I've been working on for a couple years now. It's something I'm really proud of because I've really poured my heart into this game. Like, this is a game that I want to play, with my friends, so badly. Like with Goblins, Jewel, Fairies Rule, I think I told you earlier, I was trying to make a game that I wanted, to be for families, that encouraged, little kids and their parents to play together. Well, with Immortal, I'm making a game for me, a game that I really want to play, and I'm really excited that it's so close to the next step, which is getting it on Kickstarter to get the money to finish this game and put it out there.
Right, and I've checked out the artwork for Immortal, and it is absolutely awesome. It is very breathtaking. So, in kind of a 15 to 30 second snippet, can you tell our listeners what Immortal's about and kind of why it's cool?
Sure. First of all, thank you for saying that about the artwork. I'm sure my artists are going to be very happy to hear that. On this one, with Goblins, Jewel, Fairies Rule, I directed Mike in the art, but Mike actually did all of the illustrations of those fairies and goblins for that games. With Immortal, I've actually gotten my hands dirty and done quite a bit of the artwork myself, but I've also contracted other artists, which I think their work was phenomenal, and I think they've done a really amazing job on this game. I'm really proud of the work they've done. But here to give you your soundbite about the game, Immortal it's a game of mythic strategy. So it's all about a war between the gods. So ancient gods, heroes, and monsters from different world cultures are all duking it out for supremacy. So you can play as like the Greek gods, from Mount Olympus, the Norse gods from Asgard, like Thor and Loki, Japanese gods, and monsters and spirits and beings from Native American legends also. So you can have, it's sort of this smash up crossover fight between all these legends that we've grown up as kids, and seeing them all duke it out in this very strategic game of positioning to sort of outwit and surround your opponent, capture their cards, and use the special abilities and the particular advantages of your faction, of your pantheon of gods and monsters, and really play that to your strengths and conquer the other players' characters.
Excellent. And I'm not sure when this exact podcast is going to come out, but I know that it will be further along than when we're recording. So I suggest that everybody go check it out, find out more about the game. And David, thank you so much for your time. This has just been an absolute storehouse of information. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your experience with us.
Well, thank you, Stephen. I had a great time. And if there's anything more you want to talk about, I'd be happy to come back again, because I think you're doing really good work with this podcast.
Oh, thank you so much, and we'll absolutely have to make it happen.
Awesome. Thank you.
You've been listening to another edition of the Gaming Careers Podcast. I'm Steve Rudusky, your host, and thanks so much for joining me again. You can find the show notes for this episode, as well as the extended interview, at thecompanyBard.com/episode 15. In the extended interview, David goes on to talk a lot about how to find art for your game project, as well as gives us some amazing aha moments that he's had in the process of creating his company, Gameogami. It's additional awesome information that David provided that I just wasn't able to fit into this show because of time constraints, but you should definitely check it out. Okay, that's it for today's show. See you next time.